Felix had everything a young man could ever dream of: wealth, success, and a life of luxury. His father, a brilliant businessman, had built a powerful company from the ground up, and when Felix turned 24 he took over the empire. He was not only rich but also well-trained by his parents, who instilled in him discipline, hard work, and strong family values. Under his leadership the company grew even more. New deals came in, profits soared, and Felix became one of the most successful young businessmen in Lagos. He had cars, a mansion, and access to everything money could buy. Yet despite all his achievements, there was a deep sadness in his heart, one that no amount of wealth could fix. Felix had never been able to find true love. Every woman who came into his life was drawn to his money, his luxurious lifestyle, and the endless gifts he could provide. He had been in several relationships, but they all ended the same way. The women were interested in extravagant vacations, expensive shopping sprees, and fancy restaurants, but none of them cared about him as a person. Each time he opened his heart to love, it was broken. He watched his parents, who had built a strong and loving family, and wished for the same. He didn't just want a beautiful woman, he wanted a life partner, someone who would love him for who he was, not what he had. But where could he find such a person? One evening, Felix sat in a high-end restaurant with his best friend, Nathan. They had been close since childhood, and if there was anyone Felix could confide in, it was him. Felix sighed and pushed his plate away. "Nathan, I don't know what to do anymore. Every woman I meet only wants my money. They act sweet at first, but in the end all they care about is the wealth." Nathan leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "Felix, you're a great guy, but let's be honest. Your wealth makes it hard for you to know who truly loves you. You need to find a way to see who cares for you, not for your money." Felix shook his head. "But how? I can't just stop being rich." Nathan suddenly sat up, eyes shining with an idea. "Actually, you can." Felix frowned. "What do you mean?" Nathan grinned. "Listen to me carefully. What if you left everything behind for a while? Travel to another state where no one knows you. Live a simple life. No fancy cars, no expensive clothes. Disguise yourself as a poor, ordinary man. That way, if a woman loves you, you'll know it's real." Felix stared at him in disbelief. "That's insane. You want me to leave my mansion and pretend to be poor?" "Think about it," Nathan said seriously. "You keep saying you want true love. This is the only way to find it. If you meet a woman who loves you when you have nothing, then you'll know she's the one." Felix shook his head, laughing bitterly. "Nathan, you must be joking. Leave everything behind? How will I survive?" Nathan leaned forward. "Take just enough money to get a small place and survive. But live as if you have nothing. No one will know who you are. Just try it for a few months." Felix was silent. The idea sounded ridiculous. He had spent his entire life in comfort. Could he really live like a poor man? But then he thought of his parents, of the kind of marriage he wanted. If he kept living like this, he might never find true love. That night, Felix couldn't sleep. He kept turning the idea over in his mind. It was crazy, but what if it worked? What if it led him to the woman he had been searching for? After hours of thinking, he finally made a decision. The next day, Felix called Nathan. "I'm doing it." Nathan was surprised. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Felix said firmly. "I want to know if true love still exists." Nathan helped him make arrangements. Felix would travel to Benin City, a place far from Lagos where no one would recognize him. He would rent a small apartment and live as a poor, crippled man, someone who had nothing to offer but himself. When the day came, Felix packed a small bag with only a few simple clothes. He left behind his luxury suits, watches, and designer shoes. He withdrew a modest amount of money, just enough to pay for rent and food for a while. He handed control of his business to trusted managers and promised to check in secretly. Before leaving, he stood in his mansion one last time, looking around. This was the life he had always known, the life he was leaving behind for an uncertain journey. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out, got into a simple taxi, and drove away. The journey to Benin City was long, and Felix felt a strange mix of excitement and fear. When he arrived, everything was different. There were no high-rise buildings, no luxury cars, no expensive restaurants. It was a simple city with simple people. Felix found a small, run-down apartment in a poor neighborhood. The place smelled damp and the walls were cracked. The bed was hard, the bathroom barely functional. He sat down and sighed. "This is going to be harder than I thought." But he had made his choice. He changed into old, worn-out clothes, took a stick to use as a walking aid, and slowly began his new life as a poor, crippled man. Every day he went out to the streets, watching and learning how the poor lived. He saw their struggles, their hardships, but also their kindness to one another. It was a world he had never known. One afternoon, feeling hungry, he stopped at a small roadside canteen. As he entered, his eyes fell on a young woman serving food. She was beautiful, with deep brown eyes and a warm smile. She moved gracefully, attending to customers with respect and kindness. "Welcome, sir," she said, offering him a plate of food. Felix looked up, captivated. "Thank you. What's your name?" "Abigail," she said, smiling. Felix didn't know it yet, but in that moment his life had changed forever. Felix sat at the small wooden table in the canteen, staring at the steaming plate of food in front of him. The aroma of freshly cooked rice and stew filled the air, but he barely noticed. His mind was occupied with something else. The young woman who had just served him. Abigail. There was something different about her. Unlike the women he had known in Lagos who wore expensive jewelry and designer clothes, Abigail was dressed simply. Her hair was neatly tied back and her face carried no trace of makeup, yet she had a natural beauty that stood out. More than that, there was kindness in her eyes, a warmth in her voice that felt genuine. Felix picked up a spoon and took a bite of the food. It was delicious. Abigail was busy attending to other customers, moving swiftly but gracefully. She greeted everyone with a smile, whether they were rich or poor. Felix watched as she helped an old man who didn't have enough money, telling him softly, "Don't worry, Baba. You can pay another day." Felix was impressed. She didn't treat people differently based on their wealth. Could she really be the kind of woman he was searching for? After finishing his meal, Felix reached into his pocket and handed her the exact amount for the food. "Thank you," he said, looking directly at her. Abigail nodded politely. "You're welcome. Please come again." Felix left, but he knew he would return. Living as a poor man was harder than Felix had imagined. His small apartment was nothing like his mansion in Lagos. The bed was uncomfortable, the walls had cracks, and there was no air conditioning to escape the heat. Each night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, questioning if he had made the right decision. During the day he walked the streets, sometimes pretending to beg for alms. He saw firsthand the struggles of the poor. Mothers trying to feed their children, old men working hard just to earn enough for a meal. For the first time, Felix understood how difficult life was without wealth. But through it all he kept thinking about Abigail. He visited the canteen every afternoon, always ordering the same simple meal. Each time he observed her more. She worked tirelessly, helping her mother run the place. She was always cheerful, always polite. One day Felix decided to start a conversation. "You work very hard," he said as she handed him his plate. Abigail looked surprised but smiled. "I have to. My mother and I run this place together." "Your father?" Felix asked carefully. Abigail's smile faded slightly. "He passed away a few years ago." Felix felt a pang of sympathy. "I'm sorry." Abigail shrugged. "It's okay. We're managing." Felix nodded, admiring her strength. He wanted to know more about her, but he had to be careful. He couldn't reveal too much about himself yet. As the days went by, he kept returning. Soon Abigail started noticing him too. "You don't look like someone from around here," she said one afternoon. "Did you just move to Benin?" Felix hesitated before answering. "Yes. I needed a fresh start." Abigail studied him for a moment but didn't press further. Instead she simply said, "Well, I hope you find what you're looking for." Felix smiled. If only she knew. The more Felix visited, the more he and Abigail talked. At first she was cautious, but as time passed she became more comfortable around him. She told him about her life, how she had been in university studying business administration but had to drop out in her third year because her mother couldn't afford the fees. Instead of complaining, Abigail had returned home to help her mother with the canteen, determined to support their family. Felix was amazed by her selflessness. She didn't chase wealth or luxury. She simply wanted to help her mother and make an honest living. One day, after finishing his meal, Felix stayed behind instead of leaving immediately. "Abigail," he said, "do you ever think about going back to school?" Abigail sighed. "Of course. But for now, this is where I need to be." Felix wanted to tell her that he could pay her fees, that he could change her life in an instant. But he couldn't, not yet. He had to be sure of her feelings first. So he admired her even more. She wasn't someone who would abandon her responsibilities just because things got tough. One evening, a heavy rainstorm hit Benin. Felix had stayed longer than usual at the canteen, enjoying his conversation with Abigail. By the time he was ready to leave, the streets were flooded and the rain was pouring down hard. Seeing him struggle to walk with his crippled leg, Abigail rushed over. "You can't go home like this," she said. "You'll get drenched." Felix shrugged. "I'll manage." "No," Abigail insisted. "Wait here." She disappeared into the back of the canteen and returned with an old umbrella. She opened it and handed it to him. "Take this," she said. Felix hesitated. "But what about you?" Abigail smiled. "I'll be fine. You need it more." Felix took the umbrella, his heart swelling with emotion. This was the first time in a long time that someone had shown him kindness without expecting anything in return. As he walked home under the umbrella, he knew one thing for sure. Abigail was different. He was falling for her. That night, Felix lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He was getting too close to Abigail. The plan was to test if she could love a poor man, but he had never expected to develop real feelings for her. What if she found out the truth? Would she hate him for lying? Each night, Felix secretly called Nathan to update him on his progress. "I think I've found her," Felix said one night. Nathan was silent for a moment. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Felix said. "She's kind, honest, and doesn't care about money." Nathan sighed. "Then you have a bigger problem, my friend. How are you going to tell her the truth?" Felix didn't have an answer. For now, he just wanted to enjoy the time he had with Abigail. But deep inside, he knew, sooner or later he would have to tell her everything. And he had no idea how she would react. Felix's heart raced every time he saw Abigail. Over the past few months, their friendship had grown stronger, and he found himself looking forward to every moment they spent together. Abigail, without realizing it, had become the highlight of his days. Her laughter, her kindness, and her hard-working nature captivated him in a way he had never experienced before. But the more he fell for her, the heavier the weight of his secret became. One afternoon, as the sun cast a golden glow over the canteen, Felix sat at his usual table watching Abigail move about. He had made up his mind he couldn't keep pretending anymore. He wanted her, but he needed to be sure she felt the same way. When she brought his plate of food, he cleared his throat nervously. "Abigail, can I ask you something?" She wiped her hands on her apron and smiled. "Of course. What is it?" Felix took a deep breath. "Would you ever consider being in a relationship with someone like me?" Abigail blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Like you?" Felix gestured at himself. The worn-out clothes, the walking stick, the simple life he had been living. Abigail hesitated. "Felix, you're a good man. But relationships are complicated." Felix's heart pounded. Was she going to reject him? Abigail sighed. "You see, I never thought I'd fall for anyone, especially not now. But somehow I feel different when I'm with you." Felix swallowed hard. "Different how?" She looked away for a moment before meeting his gaze. "I don't know. You make me laugh. You listen. You don't make me feel like I have to be someone else. I've never cared about money, Felix. I just want to be with someone who understands me." Felix felt like his heart would burst. He reached across the table and gently took her hand. "So, does that mean you'll give me a chance?" he asked softly. Abigail hesitated but then nodded. "Yes." Felix had never been this happy before. Their relationship blossomed over the next few weeks. Felix and Abigail spent more time together talking about life, dreams, and love. Felix marveled at how simple and genuine Abigail was. She never once asked him for money or gifts. She was content with the smallest things: an evening walk, a heartfelt conversation, or just sitting together in silence. One evening, as they strolled through the market, Felix noticed how she stopped to greet the elderly and helped a little boy who had dropped his fruit. "You're amazing, you know that?" Felix said. Abigail laughed. "Why do you say that?" "Because you care about people. No matter how little you have, you still give." Abigail shrugged. "That's just how my mother raised me." Felix smiled, but inside he was struggling. How could he keep lying to her? How would she feel when she found out he wasn't really poor? That night he called Nathan. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," Felix admitted. Nathan sighed. "You've found what you were looking for, Felix. But you need to tell her the truth before it's too late." Felix closed his eyes. He knew Nathan was right. One afternoon, Felix arrived at the canteen to see Abigail arguing with a man. The man looked angry, pointing a finger at her. "You think you're too good for me," the man yelled. "Just because you're working hard doesn't mean you don't need a man to take care of you." Felix's fists clenched. He stepped forward. "Is there a problem?" Abigail looked relieved to see him. "Felix, it's nothing. Just someone from the past." The man sneered. "Oh, so this is the guy you're with now? A crippled beggar." Felix didn't flinch, but he felt Abigail's grip tighten on his hand. "Leave, Daniel," Abigail said firmly. "I don't want to see you again." Daniel scoffed. "You'll regret this. Mark my words." With that he stormed away. Felix turned to Abigail. "Who was that?" Abigail sighed. "He was someone I used to know. He wanted me to be with him because he thought I was desperate. But I refused." Felix admired her even more. She truly didn't care about money. She cared about honesty, kindness, and respect. And he had been lying to her all along. That night, Felix stayed awake, thinking. He had tested Abigail enough. He had found someone who truly loved him for who he was. Now he had to tell her the truth. The next day he sat with her at the canteen and took a deep breath. "Abigail, there's something I need to tell you," he said. She looked at him with curiosity. "What is it?" Felix hesitated. "It's about who I really am." But before he could continue, his phone rang. He had forgotten to silence it. Abigail's eyes widened. "Felix, I thought you didn't have a phone." Felix swallowed hard. This was it. The moment of truth. Would she still love him after she learned who he really was? Felix's heart pounded as Abigail stared at the ringing phone in his pocket. "I thought you didn't have a phone," she said slowly, her eyes narrowing. For the first time since coming to Benin, Felix felt completely trapped. He had planned to tell her the truth on his own terms, but now the moment had arrived sooner than expected. He had no choice. Taking a deep breath, he pulled out the phone and silenced it. Abigail looked at him expectantly, waiting for an explanation. "Abigail," he started, his voice shaking, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Abigail crossed her arms. "Go on." Felix hesitated, then continued, "I'm not really who you think I am. I'm not a poor crippled man. My real name is Felix Bernard. I come from Lagos and I'm the CEO of a multi-million naira company. I came here pretending to be poor because I wanted to find true love. Someone who would love me for who I am, not for my money." Silence. Abigail just stared at him, her face unreadable. Felix's hands were clammy. "I never meant to hurt you," he said quickly. I was tired of women only chasing after my wealth. I had to know if there was someone out there who would love me without knowing about my money." Abigail's lips parted, but no words came out. She blinked a few times as if trying to process what she had just heard. "You lied to me," she finally whispered. Felix felt a sharp stab of guilt. "Yes, but only about my wealth. Everything else, everything I felt for you, it was real, Abigail. Every moment we shared, every conversation, every smile, it was all real." Abigail let out a shaky breath and stood up abruptly. "I need some air." She turned and walked away before Felix could say another word. Felix watched helplessly as Abigail disappeared down the road. He wanted to chase after her, but he knew she needed space. He had expected her to be shocked, maybe even upset. But the look in her eyes, it wasn't just shock. It was betrayal. Felix left the canteen that evening feeling emptier than he ever had before. That night he called Nathan. "I told her the truth," Felix said. Nathan sighed. "How did she take it?" "She walked away." There was a pause. Then Nathan said, "Give her time, Felix. If she really loves you, she'll come back. But you have to be patient." Felix nodded, even though Nathan couldn't see him. He had no choice but to wait. Abigail sat on her bed that night, staring at the ceiling. Felix, a millionaire? The thought made her head spin. Everything she had known about him, his struggles, his kindness, his simple life, it had all been a lie. But at the same time, it hadn't. He had still been the same Felix who made her laugh, who listened to her, who cared about her. So why did she feel so betrayed? She wasn't angry because he was rich. She was angry because he hadn't trusted her with the truth. Tears welled up in her eyes. She had opened her heart to him. She had believed that for once she had found someone who truly saw her for who she was. Now she didn't know what to believe anymore. For a week, Felix stayed away from the canteen. He wanted to give Abigail space, but it was torture. Every day he wanted to go back to see her to explain himself again. Then he got an idea. If words wouldn't convince her, maybe actions would. Felix called Nathan and told him his plan. Nathan laughed. "You're really going all out, huh?" Felix smiled for the first time in days. "She's worth it." The next morning, Abigail woke up to find a brand new signboard hanging in front of the canteen. Abigail's Kitchen, a taste of love and hard work. Confused, she stepped inside and gasped. The entire canteen had been transformed. The walls had been repainted, the tables and chairs replaced with newer, sturdier ones. The entire place looked fresh and inviting. Her mother stood nearby, beaming. "A young man came and did all of this," she said. Abigail's heart pounded. "Felix." Just then Felix stepped forward, dressed in simple clothes just like before. He held up his hands. "Before you say anything, just listen." Abigail folded her arms. "I'm listening." Felix took a deep breath. "I know I hurt you. I know I broke your trust. And I won't make excuses for that. But I wanted to prove to you that my feelings were real. This canteen, it means everything to you and your mother. So I wanted to help in the only way I knew how." Abigail's eyes welled with tears. "You didn't have to do this, Felix." "I wanted to," he said softly. "Because I love you, Abigail. And I don't care if you never forgive me, but I need you to know that I would give up everything. My wealth, my company, everything, just to be with you." Abigail stared at him, her heart pounding. Felix had lied, yes. But in the end he had proven one thing. His love for her was real. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She took a shaky breath. "You don't have to give up everything, Felix. I just needed to know that I was enough." Felix stepped closer, hope shining in his eyes. "You are more than enough, Abigail." A small smile tugged at her lips. "Then I forgive you." Felix let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Does that mean?" Abigail chuckled. "Yes, Felix. I still love you." Without thinking, Felix pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly. Abigail melted into his embrace, knowing, finally, that she had found something far more valuable than wealth: true love. Felix held Abigail close, his heart racing with relief and overwhelming joy. He had feared losing her forever, but here she was in his arms, forgiving him. "I promise," Felix whispered, "no more secrets. No more lies. From now on I'll be completely honest with you." Abigail looked up at him with teary eyes but smiled. "Good. Because I want to build something real with you, Felix." For the first time in his life, Felix felt complete. A few weeks later, Felix told Abigail he wanted her to visit Lagos with him. "I want you to meet my family and see my real life," he said. "I don't want there to be any more distance between us." Abigail hesitated at first, nervous about stepping into his world, but she knew she had to take this step. She wanted to see where Felix had come from and understand the man she loved. When they arrived in Lagos, Abigail was speechless. The mansion, the cars, the grandeur, it was like stepping into another world. She felt out of place, but Felix never let go of her hand. Felix's parents were waiting at the entrance. His mother, a graceful woman with a warm smile, stepped forward first. "So you're Abigail," she said, looking at her with kind but sharp eyes. "Yes, ma'am," Abigail replied, feeling a little nervous. Felix's father nodded approvingly. "We've heard a lot about you. I must say, you are nothing like the women Felix has met before." Abigail swallowed. "I hope that's a good thing." Felix's mother chuckled. "It's the best thing." They welcomed her with open arms, and by the end of the night, Abigail felt at home. After their visit, Felix made sure Abigail had everything she needed to return to school. "You're going to finish your degree," he told her. "No more struggling." Abigail had never imagined being able to go back to university, but Felix insisted. "You've worked so hard for others," he said. "Let me do something for you." With Felix's support, Abigail returned to school and excelled in her studies. But despite all the changes in her life, she never let the wealth or comfort change who she was. She remained the same humble, hard-working and kind-hearted woman Felix had fallen in love with. They visited Benin often, and Abigail's mother continued to run the canteen, which had grown even more successful. After 2 years, Felix knew it was time. He wanted Abigail to be his wife. He planned the perfect proposal on the day of her university graduation. As Abigail walked across the stage receiving her degree, she spotted Felix in the crowd, smiling proudly. But what she didn't know was that something even bigger was waiting for her outside. When she stepped out of the hall, she gasped. A red carpet had been laid out, leading to a beautifully decorated stage. Friends and family were gathered and soft music played in the background. Then Felix appeared, dressed in an elegant suit, holding a microphone. "Abigail," he said, his voice full of emotion. "You have been my greatest blessing. You taught me that love isn't about wealth or status. It's about kindness, sincerity, and trust. You changed my life forever. And now, I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you how much you mean to me." He got down on one knee and pulled out a ring. "Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Abigail's face. She didn't need to think twice. Yes. 1,000 times yes. The crowd erupted in cheers as Felix slipped the ring onto her finger. He stood up and pulled her into a deep, loving kiss. Felix and Abigail got married in a grand but heartfelt ceremony. It was not just a celebration of their love, but of their journey, of struggles, truth, and the power of sincerity. They built a home filled with love, laughter, and trust. And though they lived in luxury, Abigail remained grounded, always helping the less fortunate, always remembering her roots. Felix knew without a doubt that he had found the one woman who truly loved him for who he was. And as they sat together one evening watching the sunset, Felix took Abigail's hand and smiled. "I found true love," he said softly. Abigail squeezed his hand and whispered back, "And I found a love worth waiting for." And so they lived happily. As the years went by, Felix and Abigail's love only grew stronger. Their marriage was filled with joy, laughter, and an unbreakable bond. Despite their wealth, they chose to live a simple and meaningful life. Felix continued running his company, but he also set up a foundation to help struggling students complete their education, an idea inspired by Abigail's own struggles. Abigail, on the other hand, never forgot where she came from. She expanded her mother's canteen into a chain of successful restaurants, providing jobs for many underprivileged people. She also worked closely with Felix's foundation, ensuring that young girls had access to education and opportunities. Their love story became an inspiration to many. People admired how Felix, a wealthy man, had gone to great lengths to find true love and how Abigail, a humble and hardworking woman, had stayed true to herself despite being surrounded by luxury. One evening, as they sat on their balcony watching the stars, Felix turned to Abigail and said, "If I had to do it all over again, I would still choose you." Abigail smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "And I would still say yes." Their love was a testament to the fact that true love goes beyond wealth. It is built on trust, sincerity, and an unshakable bond that lasts forever.